My old 1984 TT600 hasn't been used for years. In fact, the last time it was registered was 2006 and it's 2015. Over the past few years, a few people in the family have tried to get it up running just to have a motorcycle to kind of play around on. For all intents and purposes, it doesn't have any spark, and I think it's probably the CDI box on this motorcycle. I know that that's an issue. I didn't want to jump right to that because I knew I'd have other things to deal with. The first thing I'm dealing with here is the fuel tank, and what I'm focusing on now is just cleaning it out. The fuel that's been in there has been in there for years, I'm sure. In fact, it was green and it kind of smelled like boiled linseed oil. So I removed the tank, which is a couple of bolts here, and then there's a little bungee cord here that loops up over that peg. And then I removed the fuel selector valve from the bottom of here. I don't know if you can see that, but that's green, it's sticky. This is what happens to gas over time. Kind of gets that glaze, and that's what causes problems with every carburetor that I've had trouble with. I've already torn this apart. As you can see, this simply has a spring in here. This fits in here like so. There's an O-ring that sits on here as well, and then that fitting just moves back and forth and lines up this plastic valve in there, and then it's all held together by this plate and two little screws. This is the shape of the internal fuel filters. They're about the diameter of a drinking straw, and all of the mesh is just disintegrating on those. So that might be a little bit challenging to replace those. I want to get something in there so that if there's large debris that gets into the tank, it'll get it before it goes through the selector valve. Then I'm going to have a downstream fuel filter on this bike as well. So I've just about finished cleaning this up, and I'm going to go ahead and put this back together. The only thing that I need to make sure I line up are these holes and make sure everything corresponds to the valve position when everything's back together. So I'll get that all back together, and then we'll be done with this part of it. With the fuel tank, I'm going to spray some cleaner in there and rinse it out with a hose, let it air dry. Down in the bottom of this tank I can actually see dirt, and I can actually see some of that glaze material from the fuel that has deposited in there. Almost looks like green paint. You can kind of see it. It's been slopping around in there. Nasty stuff. This is why you got to put that fuel preserver or drain your tanks before you store these things, because today's fuel doesn't last very long. So to put this fuel valve together, there are really very few pieces. You've got the plate, the indicator plate, the spring that goes between the handle and the valve itself. I guess I'd call that probably the most important part. When this goes back together, it essentially has two openings. This is where the fuel is going to come in. If this is turned this direction towards this main gas on position, it'll allow the fuel to come down through this port on the right and then down through the bottom here going into the carburetor. Then when the valve is turned so that this valve is in the upright position or the reserve, then this other hole corresponds to the reserve inlet here. That's where that smaller internal fuel tank filter is going to go. So this can only go together one way, because these keys right here, the space on here is different than this distance here as well. So this could really, like I said, only goes together one way. So I've already cleaned this out with some carburetor fluid. I'm going to drop that in here, place that spring in there, and then I've replaced this rubber grommet, this rubber washer, or O-ring I should say, around there. I'm just going to put a little bit of grease just to try and get everything back together without ruining that O-ring. Be honest with you, I'm using some synthetic brake grease. I don't know that it's going to matter. It's all I have, and seems like it should work. So this is just going to go in here, and then I'm going to just work this down in there until I can get that O-ring seated. And when this is flush, I should be able to twist that valve like so. Now without that thing popping out, I'm going to put this plate back on, twist it around, and it can only go one way. The only way you could screw this up is by putting all the lettering on the inside. Just going to get those touching, and then I'm going to alternate back and forth as I tighten this down so that I don't pinch that O-ring inside. Make sure that that little tab right there is going to go down and seat against the valve, against the switch here. Okay. That's much better. It's pretty tight. I think that'll wear a little bit over time and give that O-ring a chance to seat, compress a little bit. Before I took it apart, I couldn't even turn this valve. So there's one part of this whole process taken care of. I'll get that tank clean, put this all back together, and then I can start moving further down the chain. So I have a moment of defeat here with the 84 TT600 gasoline petcock assembly. I was originally trying to replace these in the tank fuel filters or strainers, and after looking on the internet and trying to locate some of this at the local motorcycle shops, I found out that I can't just buy these fuel filter strainers. Yamaha still does sell the OEM assembly, but you have to buy this entire thing, and I wasn't quite ready to put 25 bucks into something that I still believe is going to work. So I've come up with the alternative, and that's just going to simply be to place a strainer or a filter outside of the tank in between the fuel selector, or they call it a fuel cock assembly, between that and the carburetor here. This will do the same thing that these were doing, but obviously those were on the inside of the tank. Now I'll be able to get this tank back together and move on to the next piece of this.